Erik, Chapter 28.
Christine stood alone in the center of the stage, facing the curtain and the audience assembled on the other side of it. She stared at the line where the curtain met the boards of the stage. She looked entirely unprepared for it to rise. Her hands were clenched at her sides, betraying her uncertainty. I didn't think I'd seen her this nervous on a stage since that impromptu audition in Paris nearly 11 years ago. I knew the conflict that gnawed at her heart and mind. Should she turn and walk off the stage, back to Raoul and his half-promises of a better life than the one she had experienced with him so far? Or should she give in to the pull of my music and sing as I had requested, even though she suspected that siding with me on this question might be her last act as Madame de Chagny? I was fairly certain that Raoul had abided by the terms of our wager and hadn't told her of the impending shake-up in her living arrangements. That only heightened my own excitement, as I knew she was making this choice based only on the music and the men involved. I knew on those terms I had a better than equal chance of victory. She turned toward me where I stood to her right. I smiled at her, clasped my hand over my heart, sent a few fanciful kisses flying toward her off my fingertips, and settled in to wait. She looked next to her left, where Raoul was leaning toward her, gesturing madly with his hand for her to walk off and join him in their mad rush for the boat. I assumed he had Gustave already rounded up and ready to go, in case she should change her mind and go with him. I didn't see him standing beside Raoul, so I gave up my visual search and returned my gaze to Christine. I suddenly had had enough of waiting. Judging by the impatient, anticipatory murmur of the audience on the other side of the curtain, so had they. I signaled the stage manager to begin the show, and he in turn signaled the conductor and the curtain pullers. Christine took an involuntary step backward as the curtain swept upward, and the first notes of the orchestral introduction reached her ears. I hadn't intended to prolong the will she or won't she quality of this particular moment, but my overly long introduction did exactly that. Finally, it drew to a close. The entire theater held its breath. The conductor waited with his arms held aloft, ready for her to draw her first breath, so he could cue the orchestra to join her on her first note. The audience all leaned forward, eagerly enjoying the anticipation of awaiting the first sound from the world's most heavenly diva. And across the way, I could see my own air of tense suspense reflected on Raoul's face, as both of us waited to see which one of us would get to spend the rest of our life with her. She drew in the breath she would need for her first phrase, opened her mouth, hesitated for another long moment. Then my music poured out of her in a silver stream like a waterfall released from behind a dam. I gave her until the end of the first verse, but as she reached this milestone, I felt the knot of tension inside me loosen and dissolve. I had won. The words to her song were more appropriate than I could have guessed when I wrote them months before her arrival. They spoke of love and how it often remains hidden beneath the surface for years before springing forth in all its unchanged glory. I hadn't realized then that they told exactly how I felt about her, but it was glaringly obvious to me now. She turned her head toward me halfway through the song, and I read the truth in her eyes. It was how she felt about me, too. She was trying to tell me that the love she had felt for me then was still alive inside her. I felt joy rush through my soul. We would spend the rest of our lives together, living on this glorious love and on my music. The time I had considered lost, the 10 years between times that I'd seen her, seemed like less of a catastrophic loss now that I knew I could again experience her love. I noticed Raoul turn and leave the wings, walking with defeated sadness in every line of his body. She, too, saw him leave, and I saw her tense as if she were about to rush after him. But the music held her immobile on the stage, and she gave in to it, finishing the song. The dramatic notes of her final phrases seemed almost too pure for human ears, but I listened to them resound around the auditorium anyway. An instant of silence enveloped the auditorium as everyone paused to listen to the last echoes of the music, and then it disappeared as they all leapt to their feet to applaud her. I floated backstage while she took her bows back to her dressing room. Flowers had already begun to pile up at her doorway, and I scooped them into my arms and brought them inside for her. I had just gotten them all into vases when Christine burst inside with another armful. She laid the flowers on the table beside the door, then stood with her back pressed against the door and her eyes on me.
"Oh, Erik, your song, it was beautiful. It made me feel beautiful. How do you do it?"
I swiftly crossed the room to stand in front of her. My beloved, I will gladly spend the rest of my life telling you every last one of my secrets. I will put myself completely into your hands. But right now, there is something different I must do. I reached behind her to the door and twisted the deadbolt. I could have done this from inside my secret passageway, but I knew if I locked it from inside the room, Christine would be able to unlock it and flee if she should feel the need. I wanted her to feel completely safe with me. Our privacy secured, I took her head into my hands and kissed her deeply and passionately. She broke away from me, however. I backed off, disappointed, but she only wanted to strip the mask and hairpiece from me. Having gotten me barefaced, she came back to me and resumed the kiss where she had left off. I grabbed her left hand and stripped the wedding bands from it. She didn't need them for what I had planned. I placed them on the table by the door with the flowers. I wrapped my arms around her and pulled her away from the door. I turned her and walked her backward to the chaise behind her. One of her hands held her skirt out to the side so she didn't trip on it, but the other one was twined around my neck, pulling me close to her. She felt the chaise come up against her calves and sat down quite suddenly, breaking the kiss. I followed her down to the chaise, letting nature take its course. It seemed to take forever, and also felt like it was over in a second. We ended up sitting there exhausted but happy. We finally rose to our feet, giggling and half drunk on the love we were experiencing. I helped her out of her black stage costume, which was quite terribly wrinkled now. I remembered with a pang of guilt her maid saying it had taken all day to iron. I assisted her into the day dress she had worn to rehearsal and buttoned it up the back for her. She carefully undid the necklace and took the earrings off, and I handed her their case to store them in. She took my hand and pulled me toward the dressing room door, prepared to open it and go greet anyone that might be waiting for her to appear outside. We both stopped, however, at the sight of the corner of an envelope protruding through the crack in the door frame. She lifted a hand, hesitated, then plucked the envelope from its perch and slit it open with her thumbnail. I read the enclosed note over her shoulder as discreetly as I could. My beloved wife, I must beg your pardon for what looks like the height of ungentlemanly behavior, but I am leaving. I realize now that I had no right to stand between you and your music all these years. You looked happier out there on that stage than I have ever seen you. I realize now that my attitude has made you reluctant to accept singing performance opportunities, and I sincerely apologize. I am sailing home tonight. I will be staying at our summer chateau until you let me know that you have removed your things from our main residence. I assume you'll want to keep Gustav with you. I will set up an account for you to use to fund his education until he reaches manhood. My lawyer will be in touch with you to assure that both of you are decently provided for. I hope that you don't think me cruel. I am doing this because I truly believe it is how I can bring you the most happiness. For the longest time, I believed that it was my presence that made you happy. To find out that it is something else entirely is a bitter pill to swallow. I wish you all the best. I truly hope that your angel of music can give you everything I never could. Raoul.
Christine lowered the letter with a shaking hand, then turned to me to see if I had read it too. I tried to make myself look as sympathetic as I knew how. Her face crumpled and she dissolved into racking sobs. I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around her, guiding her back down to sit on the chaise beside me. She clutched the wedding bands that I had handed back to her, seemingly unable to believe that her choices had led her here. She seemed worn out by her storm of emotion tonight, and began to relax under my touch as I rubbed her back. She bent forward, supporting her head on her hands with her elbows on her knees, so I could continue my massage. Suddenly she stiffened and sat bolt upright. I lifted my hand from her in startlement and asked her what was wrong. Gustav? Where's Gustav? He knows that he is always to meet me at my dressing room after I sing. Where is he? He wouldn't be late to meet me unless something was very, very wrong. Not after that time in Prague.
She stood and paced the room distractedly, then tore the door open and rushed out into the hallway, determined to search the entire carnival for him. I grabbed Squelch, who was standing nearby. Christine's son, have you seen him? Did the Vicomte leave with him? The tone of his letter hadn't hinted at such an abduction, but I needed to cover all the options. No, Mr. Y, he replied. The Vicomte left alone. I felt cold fear as Christine's terror infected me. The small human for whom I was beginning to feel myself responsible was unaccounted for. I spun around, scanning the empty hallways as I tried to think. Suddenly, something I had heard Raoul say as he tried to convince Christine to leave earlier came back to me. Meg. It was Meg. Find Antoinette at once. Squelch heard me and ran to do my bidding. He returned momentarily with Antoinette struggling in his grasp. She was angry, but upon pressing her, I learned that Meg was indeed upset that I had had Christine come to sing in what Meg felt was her show. I also suspected that seeing Christine and I reliving the love we had shared in the past might have made her angry at Gustav, the product of that love. Antoinette confessed that she had deduced Gustav's true parentage and shared that information with her daughter. I thought back to the last time I had seen Meg, in the bar of the Newton Hotel. She had told Raoul that she went there to be close to the water, feeling that the sea had the power to wash all her troubles away. I quickly put two and two together. Meg must have abducted Gustav to drown him in the sea. He'd mentioned to me several times during our tour of the carnival that he wished he could swim. I knew Meg had overheard him say so at least once, and I feared she was about to use that information against me. I didn't know how to swim myself, but suddenly I wished I'd abandoned all my other plans that day and taken him to the shore instead. What kind of father was I to allow my son to be so lacking in such a crucial skill? Surely I could have found someone to teach him the basics. Guilt threatened to overwhelm me, but I thrust it aside in favor of taking action to stop this ominous chain of events. I grabbed Christine's arm and ran out of the theater with her in tow, explaining my rationale to her as we went. We rushed through the mad swirl of my carnival. It suddenly seemed 10 times spookier than it did on any other evening. Every costumed performer seemed all at once like a spirit or a demon, popped up from another world to torment Christine and I as we sought to reunite our family. We moved through them as politely as we could, though I could sense Christine shared my feeling of wanting to charge through them, knocking down as many as possible. Finally, we came out the other side of the throng and took the path leading to the water's edge. I rarely came down to the water, and never by night, so I was in danger of losing my way in the dark. Fortunately, one of the people I employed to tidy the beach after everyone had left for the day was there, moving along the dark strand with a lantern to check that everything was pristine for the next morning. Christine ran to her and borrowed the lantern, then ran back to me and pulled me onward to the dock. The rotating beam of the lighthouse on the point just barely revealed two figures on the end of the dock, one tall and the other half-grown. Our footsteps clattered as we rushed onto the boards of the dock and flew down its length to where the two figures stood. As we neared, the picture came into focus. Meg had the back of Gustav's shirt in her fist, holding him back from plunging into the sea below him. The poor boy was helpless as she held him suspended off balance. He had no leverage to push himself back up to the safety of the dock. All she had to do was open her hand, and my son would plunge 10 feet into the rocky-bottomed sea below the dock. I felt a surge of anger go through me as I took it in, and I plunged my hand into my pocket for the garrote that I still carried with me everywhere. I brought it halfway out, but then stopped as I realized that I had no way to use it without causing her to drop Gustav. Christine clutched at my arm, silently imploring me to do something, anything. I lifted her hand from my arm, gave her a meaningful look, and took one step toward Meg. As I took that first step, prepared to negotiate with all I had for the life of this person who was so precious to me, I thought of my own father, the unknown man who had put me out with the foster family and then neglected to pay his bill, sending me on my trajectory through the traveling fair, Persia, Paris, and finally America. Would he have done what I was preparing to do now? Offer everything up to and including his own life for his son? Knowing what I knew now about fatherhood, even having missed 10 years of it with Gustav, I suddenly decided that this unknown man who had skulked in the back of my mind my entire life wasn't worth the title. This was fatherhood, this moment of sacrifice. Nothing that man had ever done qualified him to be a father. A weight I had never known was there, tiny but not insignificant, lifted from my mind. I took a deep breath and stepped forward to deal with this situation. I finally felt like my own person, not the product of the hodgepodge of quasi-parental influences I had so inconsistently known. Coupled with the fact that I had just won the woman of my dreams, I felt like there was nothing I could not do.